A little girl, holding a worn teddy bear, whispered something that stopped a millionaire CEO in his tracks. What could she possibly say to change his life forever? This is Millionaire in Love, bringing you stories that touch the heart. She held out a teddy bear and whispered, "Please buy it. My sister needs surgery." The millionaire CEO never expected a 6-year-old would change his life forever. Lucas Evans, a man known in boardrooms across the country as one of the youngest and most successful CEOs in medical technology, stepped out of his sleek black car onto the pavement outside one of the urban clinics his company funded. His light blue tailored suit looked untouched by the summer breeze, and his dark hair was perfectly styled, but his eyes, cold blue like polished glass, carried the weight of a schedule built minute by minute. He wasn't here for emotion, only for documents, final approvals for a line of specialized surgical equipment to be installed by the end of the quarter. It was supposed to be a 5-minute visit. As he walked toward the front entrance, checking messages on his phone, he caught something unusual from the corner of his eye. 2 little girls were sitting quietly on a low stone bench outside the hospital doors. They looked so alike they had to be twins, around 6 years old, with soft brown hair and neat braids, pale pink dresses layered under light denim jackets, and eyes the same deep hazel. But what made Lucas stop wasn't their matching appearance or their silence. It was the sadness in their expressions. Can a single moment shift the course of a life? Stay with us on Millionaire in Love to find out. One of the girls sat in a wheelchair, her legs bundled in a light blanket. The other stood protectively beside her, holding a large stuffed teddy bear that looked far too loved to still be whole. He slowed without realizing it. Something pulled at him. Not pity, not curiosity, but an odd tug of recognition, like walking past a memory you haven't lived yet. As he neared the entrance, the standing girl stepped forward, clutching the teddy bear tightly. Her eyes were full of something he couldn't quite name. Desperation maybe, or a kind of innocent courage that felt older than her years. She looked up at him and said, her voice small but clear, "Will you buy my teddy bear? My sister needs surgery." For a second, Lucas didn't respond. It wasn't the request itself that stunned him. It was how calmly, how matter-of-factly she said it, like selling her most precious thing in the world was logical, reasonable, even expected. He glanced at the wheelchair, at the girl sitting there, staring into the ground, then back at the standing twin, whose small fingers clutched 5 wrinkled $1 bills in her other hand. Lucas felt his chest tighten. He had heard a lot of pitches in his life, but none like this. No one had ever tried to sell him a teddy bear to save someone's life. He crouched down slowly to the girl's eye level. "Why me?" he asked, not sure why that was the first thing that came out of his mouth. The girl hesitated, then answered, "You look like someone who has enough." Lucas couldn't speak for a moment. A strange pressure built behind his eyes, and he blinked it away. Standing quickly, he looked around for someone, any staff, a nurse, their mother, but there was no one nearby. Just the 2 girls waiting. "I want to help her," he said finally, his voice low, steady. "You can keep your bear." The girl's eyes widened. She didn't ask how or why. She just nodded and turned back to her sister. "Come on, Hannah," she said gently. "He's coming with us." And just like that, Lucas Evans, CEO, investor, strategist, who planned his days to the second and hadn't cried in a decade, followed 2 little girls into the hospital without a single thought for the meeting he had just missed. He had come for paperwork. But he had just walked into something much bigger. As Lucas followed the 2 girls through the hospital corridors, something about the pace of his footsteps felt different, slower, less certain. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, echoing through the sterile silence of the early afternoon. Around him, nurses moved quickly, voices low and focused. But all of that faded as he watched the small wheelchair glide over the polished floor ahead of him, pushed gently by the girl who had offered to sell her teddy bear. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, but there was something solid in the way she moved, steady, determined, like she was used to carrying more than her share of the weight. The girl in the wheelchair didn't say much. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her legs stiff beneath a soft blue blanket, and her head tilted slightly downward. She looked older than her age, not in years, but in the exhaustion that clung to her face. Her sister, Lucas had yet to ask their names, kept glancing back to make sure he was still following. Her braids bounced slightly with each step, and though she walked with purpose, Lucas could see the tension in her small shoulders. They finally stopped outside a room at the end of the pediatric wing. The older of the two, though he wasn't entirely sure which was older, pushed the door open without hesitation and wheeled her sister inside. Lucas hesitated for just a second before stepping in behind them, uncertain of what exactly he was walking into. The room was small and plain with a single hospital bed in the center, a side table cluttered with empty juice boxes and colored pencils, and a teddy bear with a missing eye propped up in the corner. A window let in a sliver of sunlight painting soft yellow stripes across the sheets. Sitting in the chair beside the bed was a woman in her early 30s, asleep with her head resting in one hand, her posture slumped in exhaustion. Her uniform, cheap scrubs and a worn-out jacket, told Lucas more than words could. This was someone who had been running on empty for far too long. Her shoes were still on and her name tag, slightly cracked, read Sarah Brooks. The girl turned to Lucas. "That's our mom," she said quietly. "She just came from her second job." Lucas didn't respond right away. Instead, he took in the whole scene, the girls, the hospital room, the sleeping mother. He felt out of place in his expensive suit, a man who could afford a private jet standing in a room that smelled of overworked air conditioning and hand sanitizer. But he didn't want to leave. Not now, not after what he'd seen. "What's your name?" he asked the girl standing next to him. "Haley," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "And that's Hannah." Lucas crouched beside Hannah's wheelchair and smiled gently. "Hi, Hannah. I'm Lucas." She looked at him with wide, unsure eyes, then gave the tiniest nod. "I'd like to help," he continued. "Would that be okay with you?" Hannah didn't say anything, but Haley nodded for her. "She's scared," Haley said. "But she knows you're good." "I can tell." Lucas couldn't help but smile at that, a crooked, surprised smile that hadn't appeared on his face in what felt like years. He looked over at the sleeping mother again, then stood and gently stepped closer. He cleared his throat softly, and Sarah stirred awake, blinking rapidly as she realized she wasn't alone. She looked at him, confused, before her eyes darted to her daughters, then back to him again. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, standing awkwardly. "Did someone send you? I must have missed a meeting." No, Lucas interrupted, raising his hand slightly. "You don't know me. My name is Lucas Evans. I met your daughters outside." Sarah froze, visibly confused. "Evans," she repeated, her eyes widening slowly. "As in the hospital board?" He nodded. "Yes, I run the parent company. But today, I'm just someone who heard something he couldn't walk away from." She looked at Haley and Hannah, who were both watching her closely, then back at Lucas. "What did they say?" Lucas hesitated for a moment. "Haley offered to sell me her teddy bear to pay for Hannah's surgery." Sarah sank slowly back into the chair, covering her face with one hand. Her voice cracked when she said, "She did that." Lucas took a slow breath. "Yes, and I'd like to help. I want to take care of the cost of Hannah's treatment. All of it." The room fell into stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then Sarah's shoulders began to shake. At first, it looked like she was laughing, but it wasn't. It was crying. She was crying silently, her hands still over her mouth, as if trying not to break the fragile air of disbelief surrounding them. "I've been trying for 2 years," she whispered. "Working nights, cleaning houses, delivering groceries. I never even got close." Lucas pulled out his phone and calmly said, "Then it's time someone stepped in." Haley walked over to her mother and wrapped her arms around her waist. Hannah just sat quietly, but there was a tiny glimmer in her eyes now, a spark where there had only been tired stillness before. Lucas turned toward the door, pausing for one last look. "Let me make the calls," he said. "Tomorrow, we start something new." And in that moment, no one questioned him, not because of his money or title, but because in a room where everything had been broken for so long, his words were the first thing that sounded like hope. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe to Millionaire in Love for stories that inspire. Lucas barely slept that night. Though his schedule was filled with high-level calls and contracts waiting to be signed, his mind kept returning to the hospital room, the pale-faced little girl in the wheelchair, the sister with too much weight in her voice, and the exhausted mother trying to stay afloat in a world that gave her no breaks. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Lucas was already at his office, a rare thing for a Saturday. He cancelled a meeting with investors and instead called his legal team, his personal assistant, and 2 medical board advisors. By mid-morning, he had set into motion a rapid series of events. He contacted the hospital director, approved a transfer for Hannah to a private recovery suite, and scheduled an urgent consultation with the best pediatric spinal specialist on the East Coast. This wasn't charity for him. It was something deeply personal now, and he didn't even fully understand why. Maybe it was the way Haley had looked at him without a trace of manipulation, just pure hope. Or maybe it was how small and powerless Hannah had looked, wrapped in that blue blanket, yet holding herself with quiet resilience. At noon, Lucas returned to the hospital. This time, not in his sharp business suit, but in a soft gray sweater and dark jeans, more like a human being and less like a CEO. He carried a paper bag with fresh sandwiches, apple juice boxes, and 2 small boxes of crayons he had picked up on the way. When he arrived at the room, Haley was sitting by the window drawing on scrap paper, and Hannah was still resting, her eyes half-lidded, but awake. Sarah was folding a small pile of clothes, clearly surprised to see him. "I hope it's okay I came back," Lucas said gently, holding up the bag. "I thought maybe you all could use lunch." Sarah blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. "You didn't have to." "I know," he replied. "I wanted to." They sat together for the next hour, Lucas on a chair pulled close to Hannah's bed, Sarah sitting across from him, and Haley excitedly showing off her drawings. Hannah remained quiet, speaking only in short answers, but she looked at Lucas differently now. There was curiosity instead of fear, and at one point she even smiled when he told her a story about getting stuck in an elevator as a kid. Sarah watched him carefully throughout the visit, her expression guarded but slowly softening. She had been on her own for so long that accepting help, even kindness, felt foreign. But there was something in the way Lucas moved, the way he never talked down to her or the girls, that made her want to believe he wasn't just another rich man dropping in for a photo opportunity. After lunch, Lucas pulled out a small folder. "I want to be transparent about everything," he said. "Hannah's condition is serious but treatable. The surgeon I've contacted has agreed to take her case. I've already secured the slot and recovery plan. There will be no cost, no hidden conditions. I'll cover it all personally." Sarah's voice caught. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really?" Lucas looked at her for a long pitted against time before answering. "Because no child should have to try and sell her teddy bear to save her sister, and because I can." That answer hung in the air for a moment before Sarah gave a small, tired nod. She wasn't sure she could trust this yet, but she didn't have the strength to keep refusing the only open hand she'd seen in years. Before leaving, Lucas knelt by Hannah's bed and said, "I'll be here the day of your surgery. You're not doing this alone anymore." And for the first time since they met, Hannah reached out and took his hand. She didn't say anything, but Lucas felt it. The shift, the start of something deeper. Later that evening, back at his penthouse, Lucas stood in front of the windows overlooking the city skyline. The lights flickered below like a sea of distractions, but none of it mattered. He kept seeing her face, Haley, offering him a bear as currency. That moment had altered him, and whether he was ready to admit it or not, something inside him had started to change. The morning of the consultation came with a rare softness in the air, the kind of peaceful beginning that felt at odds with everything the Brooks family had endured over the past few years. For the first time in a long while, Sarah wasn't rushing between jobs, wasn't packing lunches with trembling hands, or counting change to afford bus fare. She was sitting in a clean hospital lounge beside her 2 daughters, waiting, not with fear, but with a cautious kind of hope. Lucas arrived just minutes before the specialist, dressed again, not like a man guarding a fortune, but like someone trying to be human first. No tie, sleeves rolled, an unspoken calm about him that made him seem more like an uncle than a CEO. Haley ran to him without hesitation, her sketchbook flapping in one hand, the teddy bear in the other. She tugged at his arm, excited. I made you something, she said proudly, handing over a drawing of the four of them, Lucas, Sarah, Haley, and Hannah, standing in front of a house with flowers in the windows. Lucas smiled and crouched beside her. This is beautiful, he said sincerely, folding it carefully and tucking it into his jacket pocket like it was more valuable than any stock certificate he'd ever held. Hannah watched quietly from her wheelchair, and Lucas didn't push. Instead, he simply looked at her, nodded respectfully, and said, "Ready, brave girl?" The doctor, Dr. Rosenthal, arrived a few minutes later and shook everyone's hands with professional warmth. She reviewed Hannah's charts and MRI scans while Lucas and Sarah sat nearby. Sarah's knuckles were white where she gripped the armrest as though bracing for another blow, but instead, the doctor gave a steady nod. "It's operable," she said. "It won't be easy, but with the right post-surgery care and rehab, she could walk. Not just with assistance, fully. It's going to take time and patience, but it's within reach." Sarah gasped, tears springing to her eyes, and Haley cheered, but Hannah stayed quiet, her eyes wide. Lucas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What do we need to do first?" he asked. Dr. Rosenthal laid out a plan: additional imaging, pre-op physical therapy, and a tentative surgery date for 3 weeks out. Lucas agreed on the spot to fund the entire process, including a home nurse and therapy equipment for the recovery period. There was no hesitation in his voice, no discussion of insurance, no talk of cost. To him, it was settled. Hannah was going to have a future. After the appointment, they all went to the hospital garden for a bit of fresh air. Haley ran through the flower paths playing with her bear while Hannah sat with her mother and Lucas under the shaded gazebo. "You know," Sarah said quietly, "I've spent years praying for this, but I never imagined the answer would show up wearing designer shoes and knowing medical boards by name." Lucas laughed softly. "Neither did I," he admitted. "I thought my life was exactly where it needed to be until I heard your daughter's voice." There was a long pause between them, filled only by the chirping of birds and Haley's distant giggles. Then Sarah added, more softly, "I don't know how to thank you." Lucas looked at her, not just as a grateful mother, not just as someone he was helping, but as a woman who'd carried an entire family on her back without ever asking for help. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "You already did more than most people ever could. You survived. Now, let me carry some of it." When they finally returned to the room, Haley had made name cards for everyone out of napkins and crayons. Lucas had his placed at the edge of Hannah's bed, "Mr. Lucas, our friend." Hannah looked at it, then at him, and without saying a word, she reached out and gave him the bear. "He's yours today," she whispered. "He helps when people are scared." Lucas took the worn plush toy in his hands, heart catching in his throat. It was the same bear she had once offered as payment. But now it wasn't desperation. It was trust. And it meant more than anything money could buy. The weeks leading up to Hannah's surgery passed in a delicate blur. A strange combination of anxious waiting and quiet moments that stitched the family and Lucas closer together. What began as an unexpected act of generosity was evolving into something much deeper, something even Lucas wasn't sure how to define. He visited the hospital almost daily, not out of obligation, but because he couldn't stay away when he wasn't in meetings or signing contracts. He was at Hannah's bedside reading books, helping Haley with puzzles, or simply sitting in calm silence with Sarah, letting the quiet be enough. Sarah began to change, too. The shadows beneath her eyes didn't vanish overnight, but they softened. She no longer looked like a woman on the brink of collapse. Lucas noticed how she started to laugh more freely, how she leaned into moments instead of rushing past them. They started talking about their pasts, about how she once studied to be a teacher before life took a sharp turn, about how Lucas had lost his parents at a young age and buried himself in work ever since. It wasn't flirtation, not exactly, but something raw. The sharing of battle scars. It was intimacy in its purest form. No romance, no pretense, just recognition. Haley had grown completely attached to Lucas by now. She called him our giant friend and insisted he helped build pillow forts in the hospital room. She would sometimes fall asleep on his lap mid-conversation, clutching that same teddy bear that now passed between them like a silent guardian. Hannah, still quiet by nature, grew more responsive in his presence. She didn't smile often, but when she did, it was like witnessing the slow blooming of a flower no one thought would grow again. One night, just 4 days before the scheduled surgery, a thunderstorm rolled across the city. Lucas arrived at the hospital late, drenched from walking the last block because traffic had stalled. He stepped into the room to find the power flickering slightly and both girls bundled under blankets. Sarah was seated by the window, looking out at the storm with a distant expression. Lucas gently knocked on the doorframe. "Didn't think I'd let the rain stop me," he said with a tired smile. Sarah smiled softly and waved him in. Haley was already half asleep, and Hannah was staring at the ceiling, her fingers absently tracing the threads of her blanket. Lucas sat down beside her and whispered, "Want me to tell you a secret?" Hannah nodded slowly, and he leaned in. "I used to be afraid of hospitals. When I was your age, they scared me more than anything." She looked surprised. "You don't look scared," she whispered. Lucas tapped his chest. "That's because I keep the scared part in here and the brave part out here." She giggled faintly, the sound barely audible, but entirely real. The room dimmed further as the storm grew stronger, and Sarah lit a small battery-powered lantern. They sat together in that circle of soft light, Lucas telling ridiculous stories about his clumsy childhood, Sarah finally relaxing enough to laugh without apology, and the girls listening like they were hearing magic. For the first time in a long time, they weren't thinking about the surgery or the pain or the years of struggle. They were just a group of people weathering a storm together. Later that night, as Sarah tucked the girls in, Lucas stood to leave. She followed him quietly into the hallway. "You've done more than enough," she said, her voice low. "You've changed our lives already. You don't have to keep showing up." Lucas met her gaze with a steadiness that surprised even him. "I know," he said, "but I want to. This stopped being about obligation a long time ago." Sarah's lips parted as if to speak, but she said nothing. Instead, she simply nodded, and for a long second, they just stood there in silence. Something unsaid passed between them, unspoken, unnamed, but undeniably there. Lucas left that night with wet shoes and a full heart. He knew the surgery would be a trial, and the days ahead would not be easy. But somewhere in that stormlit room, something had taken root, a connection, a beginning, a quiet promise of something more than healing. Not just for Hannah, for all of them. The day of Hannah's surgery arrived with the quiet intensity of a turning point, like the whole world was holding its breath. The sun had barely risen when Lucas arrived at the hospital, earlier than anyone expected. Dressed in simple clothes, and carrying a small bag filled with snacks, coloring books, and a lucky charm he had bought on the way, a tiny ceramic elephant with its trunk up, something his mother once told him symbolized protection. When he entered the room, Sarah was already up, pacing gently, her hands clasped tightly together in front of her chest. Haley sat on the edge of the bed beside Hannah, whispering to her sister about silly things, what kind of cake they'd eat when she got better, what kind of puppy she wanted when they had a yard. Hannah listened silently, her eyes wide and unusually still. Lucas didn't say much at first. He simply walked over to the bed, knelt beside it, and offered Hannah the small elephant. "For luck," he said. She took it with trembling fingers and gave him a barely perceptible nod. Her fear was real, and it wrapped around the room like fog, but so was the strength that came from the people surrounding her. Lucas had seen many hospital rooms in his life, had funded hundreds of them, visited children, cut ribbons, signed checks. But none of those moments had ever felt like this. This wasn't charity. This was family. Chosen, unexpected, but no less real. The surgical team arrived just after 8. Dr. Rosenthal came in personally, her demeanor calm, but focused. She explained again what they were about to do. The spinal correction, the expected hours, the risks and chances. Sarah listened as if her entire soul depended on every word. Haley clutched her mother's hand tightly and tried to be brave, but tears clung to her lashes despite her best efforts. When it was time to wheel Hannah to the operating room, Lucas surprised everyone by asking to go alone. "Just to the doors," he added quickly. Dr. Rosenthal agreed without hesitation. As they pushed the bed down the corridor, Lucas walked beside Hannah, his hand resting lightly near hers. "You've got this," he whispered. "I'll be right here when you wake up." She didn't reply, but just before the doors closed, she whispered something only he could hear. "Thank you for not giving up on us." Lucas stood outside the door with Sarah and Haley, watching the doors swing shut. The next few hours were agonizing. They waited in the family lounge, sipping cold coffee, trying to distract Haley with games. But time moved like syrup. Lucas didn't leave once. He called his office only once, briefly, to tell them he was unavailable for the rest of the day. He sat with Sarah, sometimes in silence, sometimes asking her about her childhood, about what Hannah was like before the wheelchair. Slowly, their conversation turned into something deeply personal. She told him about her dreams, about how she used to write poetry when she couldn't sleep, and how motherhood had been the most exhausting, beautiful chaos of her life. He shared pieces of himself he hadn't said aloud in years. How he had buried himself in work, not just to succeed, but to avoid ever having to be vulnerable again. Then, finally, after nearly 9 hours, Dr. Rosenthal returned. She looked exhausted but smiled gently as she approached. "It went well," she said. "We got the alignment we hoped for. She's stable. She's going to recover, but it will take time and patience." Sarah broke down in tears, falling into Lucas's arms without thinking. And for the first time, Lucas didn't feel the distance between his world and hers. He held her, letting her sob against his chest, and he knew without a doubt that this moment, more than any contract or fortune, was the most meaningful thing he'd ever been part of. When they were finally allowed to see Hannah in recovery, she was pale and groggy, but breathing steadily, her tiny frame connected to machines that beeped with regular reassurance. Haley tiptoed up to her sister's side and kissed her forehead, whispering, "You did it." Lucas stood near the edge of the room, not wanting to intrude, but Hannah opened her eyes just enough to see him and lifted one weak finger to gesture him closer. He stepped forward, unsure, until she smiled faintly and mouthed, "Thank you." That night, Lucas didn't go home. He stayed at the hospital, sleeping in a stiff chair beside Sarah and Haley, who had curled up together under a spare blanket. He didn't need a bed. He didn't need a hotel or a driver or any of the things that once made him feel important. What he had now was something different, something true. He looked around at the dimly lit room, the steady breath of a child who had just won a second chance, and the quiet strength of the woman who never stopped fighting. And as he closed his eyes, Lucas realized something he hadn't admitted even to himself. He hadn't just helped save a little girl's life. That little girl and her family had already started saving his. The days following Hannah's surgery unfolded with a slow, careful rhythm, as though life itself understood that healing could not be rushed. Her body was bruised and fragile, but her spirit, remarkably, was steadier than ever. Lucas returned to the hospital every morning, not as a visitor, but as a constant. The nurses grew used to seeing him there, often offering a quiet smile or nod of respect. Not because he was wealthy or important, but because he stayed, because he listened, waited, and never once acted like the hospital was beneath him. Hannah's recovery was difficult. She was often too tired to talk, sometimes in pain, and occasionally frustrated when her body wouldn't do what she wanted. But she never gave up. She gritted her teeth through each movement, let herself cry when the discomfort was too much, and always reached for her little elephant charm when she needed strength. Lucas watched all of this from a front row seat, filled with an emotion he wasn't used to, pride. Haley, ever the bright spark of the room, took on the role of Hannah's cheerleader. She made signs with markers, clapped after every therapy session, and even made her sister medals out of candy wrappers and tape. Lucas bought her a scrapbook so she could record the journey. Every day she added something new, a drawing, a quote from Hannah, even a silly joke Lucas had told her about a chicken that tried to become a surgeon. The laughter helped. It softened the rougher moments and kept their hearts from sinking. Sarah remained at Hannah's side constantly, refusing to leave, even for a minute, unless Lucas was there. And whenever they were alone, Lucas and Sarah began talking more, not just about doctors and hospital bills, but about real life. They spoke about their childhoods, their regrets, the strange turns their lives had taken. Lucas confessed that before meeting them, his life had felt incredibly full on paper, yet achingly hollow in the quiet. Sarah admitted how she used to lie awake wondering if she had failed her daughters, even though she knew she had done everything she possibly could. The vulnerability between them became a quiet thread that tethered their conversations. Nothing romantic had been said, not yet, but everything about the way they looked at each other hinted at something growing in the space between their shared exhaustion and gratitude. Then came the morning of Hannah's first steps. She had been practicing with the physical therapist for nearly a week. And that day, she finally told them she wanted to try without help, just a few steps, just from the hospital bed to the chair beside it. The room felt completely silent as she rose, her legs trembling slightly, her face flushed with both fear and determination. Haley held her breath. Sarah gripped the edge of the bed. Lucas stood frozen, hands clenched in front of him. Hannah took one step, then another, then two more. She reached the chair and sat down slowly, tears filling her eyes. Not from pain, not from failure, but from triumph. Sarah cried openly. Haley screamed and hugged her. And Lucas, who had seen 1,000 contracts signed, empires built, and technology evolve in real time, felt his chest tighten in a way no business achievement had ever done. He crouched beside Hannah and whispered, "You are the strongest person I've ever met." She didn't speak, only reached for his hand and held it tightly. That night, Sarah asked him to walk her to the parking lot. It was late, and the air outside was warm with the hush of early summer. They walked in silence until they reached her car. She turned to him, the soft orange glow of the street lamp illuminating her tired but smiling face. "You've changed everything," she said quietly. "Not just for Hannah, for all of us." Lucas didn't reply immediately. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that he hadn't simply inserted himself into this family's life out of generosity. He had been searching for something he didn't even know was missing, until he found it in the unwavering eyes of two little girls and the strength of a woman who refused to give up. "I didn't know what I was missing," he admitted, voice lower than usual. "Until you three showed me." Sarah didn't say anything for a moment. She just stepped forward and, without warning, hugged him. It was warm and trembling and grateful. He closed his eyes and let himself lean into it. Let himself feel something more than control, more than success. He felt human again. And as they stood in the parking lot beneath a darkening sky, neither of them had to say what they already knew. Something had begun here. A bond, a possibility, a future. 6 months later, a hospital room that once held silence and worry was long forgotten. It had been replaced by the sound of laughter echoing through a modest but warm home nestled on the edge of a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. Hannah was no longer confined to a wheelchair, and though she still moved carefully, each step she took was now steady, filled with purpose. Her legs, once marked by limitation, now carried her down the hallway toward the kitchen where the smell of cinnamon rolls drifted through the air. Haley was already at the table, her hands covered in flour as she tried to help make breakfast. Lucas was beside her, wearing an apron that was clearly too small, his shirt already smudged with dough, but he didn't seem to care. He had never looked more content, more himself. Sarah entered the room from the back porch, wiping her hands on a towel, and paused for a moment just to take it all in. Her eyes softened as she looked at the scene, the two girls laughing over a bowl of batter, Lucas pretending to be helpless with a whisk in his hand, and sunlight spilling through the window like a blessing. This wasn't the life she had ever imagined, not even in her best dreams. It was better because it had been built, not from fantasy, but from real struggle, real sacrifice, and the most unexpected love. Lucas had changed. Not in the way people usually mean it, not with grand gestures or a sudden moral transformation. He had simply begun to let life in. The walls that once protected him from emotional attachment had slowly crumbled under the weight of two little girls' courage and one woman's quiet strength. His penthouse sat empty now, more often than not. Its silence replaced by bedtime stories, spilled juice, early morning footsteps, and the kind of chaos that he once thought would be a distraction, but had become the very rhythm of his happiness. The adoption process had taken time, but it was now official. Hannah and Haley were no longer just the Brooks twins. They were Evans girls. On paper, Lucas was now their father, but in their hearts, he had been that since the day he knelt beside Hannah's hospital bed. They called him Dad now, sometimes formally, sometimes teasingly, and every time he heard it, something inside him melted in the best way. Later that afternoon, the four of them went to the park. It wasn't a special occasion, just a warm day and the desire to be outside. Lucas pushed Hannah gently on the swing, watching her legs move in rhythm as she laughed. Haley raced ahead to the slides, waving from the top, calling out, "Watch me." Sarah sat on the bench, her hand brushing against Lucas's when he joined her. For a moment, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The quiet between them was no longer heavy. It was full, rich with everything that had passed and everything that was coming. Lucas turned to her and said, almost absent-mindedly, "I used to think success was measured in numbers, deals, awards." He paused. "But I was wrong. It's this. It's you. It's them." Sarah's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She simply smiled and nodded. "We saved each other," she said. "You gave them a future, and you gave me room to breathe. But you know what? You needed saving, too." He looked at her, at the girls, at the sun dipping slowly behind the trees, and knew she was right. He hadn't rescued them. They had met in the middle of heartbreak and built something new, something no money could buy, a family. That evening, they returned home as the sky turned pink and soft with twilight. The girls curled up on the couch under a blanket, and Lucas read them a story. Sarah sat beside them, her hand resting lightly on his knee, her head leaning on his shoulder. When the girls drifted off to sleep, Lucas stayed there, unwilling to move, holding on to the moment like it was something sacred. Outside, the world kept spinning, unaware of the miracle that had quietly unfolded inside one small house. And in the hearts of four people who had once been strangers, the deepest truth had taken root. Love doesn't always come as a lightning strike. Sometimes it shows up in the shape of a bear, a question asked by a brave little girl, and a man who thought he had everything until he realized he had nothing without them. In my view, the ending of this story is quietly powerful and emotionally honest. It doesn't rely on dramatic twists or fairy tale perfection. Instead, it celebrates the kind of healing that takes time, trust, and everyday love. What makes it beautiful is that it begins in pain and uncertainty but ends in the creation of a chosen family, one built not on obligation or blood, but on compassion, respect, and transformation. Lucas doesn't save the girls and their mother in a one-sided act of charity. He allows himself to be changed by them just as much. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound relationships grow out of the most unexpected moments and that real wealth isn't measured in money, but in love freely given and deeply received. Thank you for joining us on Millionaire in Love. Hit that subscribe button for more stories that warm the heart and inspire the soul.